I direct the Humanities, Mahindra Humanities Center here at Harvard. I'm delighted that to have this very discriminating audience. Matt Damon is speaking across the road, and you absolutely made the right choice. Thank you. In case you haven't read it, I want to give you just a brief sense of the extraordinary pleasures of reading William Dalrymple's Return of a King. The low, barren desert hills on the disputed waterlands between Persia and Afghanistan are no place to get lost at night. Even today, it is wild, arid, remote country, haunted only by soaring hawks, packs of winter wolves, and opium smugglers working the old caravan routes. Figures move small and slow through the immensity of the sun-blasted landscape. 200 years ago, it was an area travelers tried to avoid even during the day. Its valleys and passes the refuge of brigands who took full advantage of the debatable lands between the region's warring principalities to pursue their trade. It was the dog days of October 1837 and the end to a long week for Lieutenant Henry Rawlinson. Little did Henry know that coming up fast behind him, notebook in hand, cell phone in the other, was young Dalrymple, hungry for history, hot for a spellbinding story. Welcome, Will. In the space of a single paragraph, Dalrymple moves from travel narrative to history in broad strokes, the story of Lieutenant Rawlinson, one of his dramatis personae. As one of many glowing reviewers wrote, the seductive artistry of Dalrymple's narrative, with my little bit added to it, draws the reader into events that are sometimes almost unbearable, but the account is so perceptive and so warmly humane that one is never tempted to break away. There is no preface to the book that discusses the current war, and as far as I can tell, William doesn't directly mention it until 5 or 6 pages from the end, yet it looms throughout, and I'm sure it'll loom large in our discussion today. It is one of his many achievements in Return of a King that Dalrymple evokes the events he narrates and the characters he describes with a remarkably nuanced sense of both the distance and the immediacy of this past. By the point at which he directly connects the two wars in his author's note, we've already felt profoundly the echoes between past and present, between our predicament and theirs. William Dalrymple's many books include In Xanadu, an account of his journey to retrace on foot Marco Polo's route from Jerusalem to Mongolia, City of Jinns, about his adopted home of Delhi, The Last Mughal, The Fall of a Dynasty, Delhi 1857, and most intriguing and interesting of all, 9 Lives in Search of the Sacred in Modern India, which was accompanied by a world tour with a band consisting of some of the Indian and Pakistani mystics featured in his book, including hymn singers and a prison warden and a part-time dancer, widely believed to be an incarnation of the god Vishnu. We're very much hoping that this cabaret will be restaged at the Humanities Center sometime in its next world tour. Tonight, William will be discussing The Return of a King, The Battle for Afghanistan, 1839 to 42, just published in the US. There are a few remaining left rare copies of the book outside. If you want to buy one, you have to do so now. In fact, if during the talk you send me notes, I will make sure that a copy is reserved for you. Please make sure that you get there before the crowd does, otherwise you'll lose your copy. William has written and hosted a number of television and radio series and regularly writes for The New Yorker, The Guardian, TLS, New York Review of Books, The New Statesman, and other publications. He's won many prizes, including Britain's most prestigious history award, the Wolfson Prize, and India's leading prize, the Vodafone Crossword Award for Nonfiction. He's founder and co-director of the Jaipur Literary Festival. As of next year and for the following 3 years, the Jaipur Festival has been very hospitable to us, and the Mahindra Humanities Center will have its own space and will be programming in collaboration with the Jaipur Festival. Our first series, if I may say that, will be on the 7 deadly sins in our times. Thank you. Do you want to sit here?
Oh, yes. You're showing pictures, right? Yeah.
Yes, just pictures.
Huh? Good. Sit there.
Do we have the lights down? Well, I might begin where Homie left us, on this bleak, sun-blasted steppe somewhere between Herat and Meshed. We've just come from this afternoon from DC, where there's the Cyrus cylinder on loan from the British Museum, and that was translated by this same character, Henry Rawlinson, in another of his avatars. But on this particular moment, when he's spotted on his horse on this road in northeast Persia in the dog days of October 1837, he's heading up to Meshed, where the Shah of Iran, Mohammed II Qajar, is about to fulfill his coronation promise to retake the disputed border city of Herat, claimed by both the Qajars and the Saduzais of the ruling dynasty of what would become Afghanistan. And he has been riding from Kermanshah in the far southeast of the country, where the same part of his life that he's translating the Cyrus cylinder, he's been working on the Beistun inscription and trying to take rubbings of the ancient Persian inscriptions there. And he's been on his horse for 2 nights, and one day and 2 nights. And as he's completely exhausted, and after all this time on his horse, he slips into a sleep on his saddle, and presumably jerks awake 20 minutes or half an hour later to find that his horse has wandered off the road. And he has no idea where he is, and it's a dark night. And so he's very relieved when, after a couple of hours, wandering around in the desert, dawn breaks over the Koi Shah Jahan mountains. And then he becomes slightly less pleased, because coming towards him, he sees this cloud of dust in the dawn light, which resolves itself into a large body of horsemen, cavalry, riding towards him. There's only him and a groom together. And so he does what any of us would do in this situation. He backs off. He heads into a little side valley to observe what's following. And, well, it could be the Heratis coming for the Qajars, it could be the Persians coming for the Afghans, it could be those opium smugglers whom you mentioned, it could be these brigands with their debatable lands, it could be any of this lot. Instead, well, before I say what he sees, perhaps we should go back and make a little bit of context. After Waterloo and the French being knocked out of the picture, there are 2 European land empires competing for this part of Asia. The British have been bursting out of their coastal enclaves, Calcutta, Bombay, Madras, since the 1760s, and particularly under Marquis Wellesley, the forgotten elder brother of the Duke of Wellington, under whose brief rule of only 5 or 6 years, more of India is conquered than Napoleon conquers of Europe. Enormous chunks of the ex-Mughal empire absorbed into the company. And the company is such a strange thing. We sort of take it for granted because it's such a sort of part of Indian history, but it's a very bizarre institution. It is a public limited company. It has shareholders. It has a boardroom. It has annual general meetings. But it also has the largest standing army in Europe, in Asia. And to try and
find a modern equivalent, you'd have to think of sort of Microsoft with nuclear submarines, or PepsiCo with fighter jets, or something. A deeply sinister creature, a company which controls an empire and has an enormous army. While all this is going on, the British have expanded out of Calcutta. By 1837, where we are, they are up as far as Ludhiana, on the edge of the Sutlej, peering into Ranjit Singh's Punjab, and beyond that, the Himalayas and this unmapped space that we call Afghanistan. At the same time as all this is going on south of the Himalayas, the Russians are moving southwards, ever since the time of Peter the Great, absorbing great chunks of the steppe. This is the sort of period that young Tolstoy is running around writing Haji Murad. The Russians are on the Orenburg line, facing on to Samarkand, Bukhara, Khiva, and all the Central Asian khanates, which over the course of the late 19th century and 20th century will be absorbed into the Russian Empire. And anyone sitting in a gentleman's club in Pall Mall or a war room in St. Petersburg can see very obviously that these two empires are coming together, and that at some point, if this trajectory carries on, they will meet somewhere in this unmapped space in the middle. But there is still a huge amount of territory between them. And many kingdoms, including, I mean, on the British side of the Himalayas, Ranjit Singh's Khalsa is an extremely formidable military force, very well organized administrative force, officered by ex-Napoleonic generals who train it up to a high standard of technical and military capacity. So there's no imminent danger at all of these two empires meeting. It may happen in the future. This does not, however, stop a huge variety of right-wing polemicists. Is Neil Ferguson here today? The kind of the Neil Fergusons of their day, writing sort of alarmist imperial propaganda about how the Russians are about to seize Afghanistan. Once they've got to Herat, it's just a 3-week march into British India. They'll be at the doors of Calcutta in a week or two. This kind of stuff, this sort of alarmist nonsense gets churned out with increasing frequency in the 1830s. And the idea, the Hawks say, is that if the British just get their act together and go into Central Asia and seize Afghanistan, they can control the crossroads from Iran to China, from Samarkand to Delhi. All this can be theirs, say the right-wingers. You just go in there, go up there, seize it, it'll be yours. And then there's a whole economic dividend which they go on about. There's a huge amount of rhetoric about the possibility of the markets of Central Asia. Open up the Indus. The Indus trade will be yours. We can market Manchester cottons all the way to Samarkand. All of which makes what Rawlinson sees coming down that valley towards him all the more important. Because what he sees is not drug smugglers, not Persians, Qajars, or anything. It's a body of imperial Russian Cossack cavalry heading into Afghanistan. And for a young intelligence officer in the 1830s, this is the golden bullet. This is the weapons of mass destruction. This is the yellow cake, the non-existent yellow cake. And like the yellow cake, it's then comprehensively misstudied, misattributed. A whole mythology is deduced from this sighting. And a group of ideologically driven hawks take this one sighting and manage to create a war that they already want out of it. Of course, nothing like this would ever happen today. They, within 18 months, a plot is being hatched. No, within 18 months, a war is being declared. But immediately, things are getting moving. The notice of this sighting of this character, he's called Ivan Vitkovich, extraordinary and interesting character. One of the most interesting characters I came across in the course of researching this book. Actually not a Russian at all. He's Polish. He's from Vilnius. And age 14, Vitkovich is found organizing anti-Russian activities in his high school, and is sentenced along with his chums to life imprisonment on the steppe. They didn't mess around with 3 strikes or anything in those days. And is sent off in chains to the steppe, where he decides, 2 of his friends commit suicide. He decides to join the enemy, to go across, and puts himself at the service of the Russians, learns the languages, and becomes the first Russian to go into Bukhara. Why do they go into Bukhara? Is again something with kind of rather modern resonances. This man is a kind of rather sort of swaggering, suave, oversexed Scot called Alexander Burns. Burns is sent off to go and spy out if there are any Russians in Bukhara. There's a long and elaborate lead up to this. First of all, they want to map the Indus, which they think is going to be their route into Central Asia. And the most elaborate sort of ploy is made. Ranjit Singh, the ruler of the Punjab, who we can see probably here on his elephant, prefers, even to elephants, horses, and has been known to declare war to one of the petty chieftains of the Punjab hills in order to get a stallion. And so the East India Company use this information, and they declare that they will give him 4 Suffolk drays, these enormous English cart horses. And it's all a big ruse. They say they can't march these great horses up the roads of Sindh. They're going to have to send them by boat. So they're allowed to put a boat into the Indus. Someone has the bright idea of adding to it an old carriage that used to belong to the Lord Mayor of London. And inside the carriage is put a team of geographers from the Navy who are busy measuring the flow and the hydraulics of the River Indus so that they can make a map and the amount of water passing every minute at every particular bend to work out whether they can send steamers up the Indus. And this unlikely party, with Burns in charge, gets up the Indus, goes to Lahore. He then goes up through Kabul to Bukhara, writes a best-selling travel book about it, which is translated into French, and the Russians read the French edition. So they suddenly realize that the British are in Central Asia. So although there had been no Russians in Central Asia to begin with, now they send Vitkovich to unravel the network of intelligences that Burns has organized to send news from Bukhara. So rather like there was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq before you guys invaded it, and then Iraq came there. Sorry, then Al-Qaeda came there, so there were no Russians in Bukhara before the Brits stirred the whole thing up. There's a lesson here somewhere that be careful what you worry about, or else you might bring that monster into being. Anyway, we're jumping ahead of ourselves slightly here. So the idea is that the British will use their most useful asset, who's been sitting around in Ludhiana for a while. This man is Shah Shuja ul Mulk Durrani, the grandson of Ahmad Shah Durrani, the founder of the Afghan state. Briefly, over the ruins of the Mughal, Safavid, and Uzbek empires, Ahmad Shah Durrani builds this Afghan empire. He defeats the Marathas at Panipat and seizes a great deal of Afghanistan, eastern Persia, most of modern Pakistan, Kashmir. But this empire, mushroom-like, grows very fast and diminishes very fast. And by the time his grandson inherits it, only a few years later, it's reduced to parts of modern Afghanistan. And Shuja, who inherits this empire at the age of 13, has lost it by the age of 21. And he then loses his most proud and precious possession, the Kohinoor diamond, which Ranjit Singh filches from him. And he goes off more or less penniless with his wives into Ludhiana, where the British East India Company decide to keep him as an asset that they might be able to use in the future. They give him a pension, they give him a haveli, and the main British spy master, a man called Sir Claude Wade, whose entire archive, incidentally, sits almost unread in the Anarkali archives in Lahore, much of it in Persian and uncatalogued. But the English section quite well catalogued, where Wade, who's sending out all these Kashmiri carpet dealers to map the Himalayas and report back, and has the very first British-Indian spy network in Central Asia. Wade keeps Shah Shuja sweet. Burns, the guy who wrote the travel book, puts all his superiors' nose out of joint. He's too glamorous, he's too public. He was received at Buckingham Palace by the Queen. Queen Victoria is a great fan of his book. He's gone to Paris, got the gold medal of the French Geographical Society, comes back to India. All his superiors hate him. So that when, particularly Wade hates him, the spy master who's been, we know this sort of character so often today, the great Central Asian expert who's never been to Central Asia. Wade's been sitting in Ludhiana running the spy network, but has never actually been to Afghanistan and is most put out when Burns, the younger man, who's so public and so glamorous, has been to Afghanistan and sets himself up as the rival expert on Afghanistan. So when Burns reports that it's completely unnecessary for the British to go to war, remove the existing emir of Afghanistan, Dost Muhammad Khan, and to replace him with Shah Shuja, when he sends successive notes saying this simply isn't necessary, it's quite easy to cobble together some sort of compromise where Dost Muhammad can stay in power. He's perfectly happy to enter into full diplomatic relations with Britain. He'll be very happy not to enter into relations with the Russians. But his advice is ignored, largely due to departmental jealousies. And within 18 months, this incredible expedition to leapfrog the Punjab and enter Afghanistan and seize it has come from gentleman club fantasies and Pall Mall to actually be policy and reality. And the initial plan is that Ranjit Singh will do it for the British. The idea is that it'll be a Sikh war in British interests. The Sikhs will be armed and given all sorts of encouragement to go and attack Afghanistan and install Shah Shuja for the British. But the guy who's in charge of the expedition is completely unequal to the task of negotiating with Ranjit Singh, who runs rings around him. The man in charge of the expedition is Sir William Macnaghten. Poor Macnaghten should never have left the Secretary's office, writes his deputy. He's ignorant of men, even to simplicity, and utterly incapable of forming or guiding administrative measures. The judicial line would probably have suited him best, and even then, only in the Court of Appeal, judging only written evidence. Just the man you need to run an invasion of Afghanistan. So, under this genius, this army assembles at Ferozpur. All the wonders of the East India Company army. It's the largest force they'll put into the field since the fall of Tipu Sultan. 14,000 East India Company sepoys, 6,000 irregulars, 21,000 troops of all, accompanied by some 38,000 Indian camp followers. They march off to war with 30,000 camels. One brigadier needs 50 camels to carry his kit, while the ranking British general needs 260 to bring all his medals and uniforms. Leading the way is the Bengal division, which marches towards Afghanistan with its own pack of foxhounds. 30 camels are given only over to just the wine cellar. There are 5 camels carrying just cheroots and cigars, and 1 camel goes off into Afghanistan carrying eau de cologne. And the only thing they haven't brought with them is a map. They have absolutely no idea where they're going because there isn't a map. And off they go. Anyone idea where Afghanistan is? Go straight, sir. Go straight. There's all this sort of stuff's going on. And here they are, streaming over the hills. Absolutely no idea where they are. And they're so desperate to find a map, they actually buy off one of the Napoleonic generals who's passed through Afghanistan on his way to the Punjab, his sketch maps, which they paid £10,000 for, which is a kind of a colossal sum of money in those days. You could add a couple of noughts to get the current figure. And it's a complete catastrophe. Macnaghten doesn't know where the water is, they haven't got enough food. They were meant to set off in the middle of winter, so all the sepoys are in their thick winter uniform. They go through the broiling deserts of Baluchistan at the height of summer in this kit. And the poor old sepoys are dropping like flies. A quarter of them die through dehydration and heat stroke, without a single Baluchi kind of unsheathing a single sword. But the Baluchis are there too to add to the chaos. Sniping down and running off. The the Khan of Kalat sees this army, ragged army, passing through and says, "It's all very well, Burns, you bringing an army in, but have you any idea how you're going to get it out again?" Which is a very good question that we might ask several people today. And yet, such is the surprise when this ragged force debouches out of the back end of the Kojak Pass into Helmand and the Dasht south of Kandahar, that the rulers of Kandahar flee to Iran, and Shah Shuja is able to pay his respects at the pay his respects at the tomb of his grandfather Ahmad Shah Durrani's tomb. He puts on the cloak of the Prophet, which is exactly incidentally what Mullah Omar did in 2001, declaring himself Amirul Mu'minin, the leader of the faithful. From there, British intelligence, of course, never gets anything wrong then or now. British intelligence announces that there is no walls to Ghazni, that it's an unfortified city, a measure of the brilliant preparation that had been made for this attack. And having pulled these enormous cannon up from Baluchistan and having to disentangle them all, one wheel on one bullock and another, the main body of the cannon on another, up the hill, back the back end, they decide to leave the cannon behind in Kandahar. So when they get to Ghazni and find that it has actually the best walls of any fortress in Central Asia, these enormous fortifications, they're a bit stuck. But someone volunteers to place a gunpowder charge in front of the main gates. They blow up the main gates, having done a diversion at the back, and in they go. And this is the only actual engagement that takes place in the whole course of the invasion. They suffer 100 casualties only. That's the only fighting that takes place. And by a month after that, Shah Shuja's back in the Bala Hissar, which he left 30 years earlier. He left it at the age of 21. He's now 51. He's back on his throne. And everyone's completely tickled pink about this. This is absolutely wonderful. With very little cost, other than the quarter of the force that died of heat stroke and dehydration, the British have conquered this major strategic asset. And to make things even better, news comes through within the week that the Russians have lost a force trying to capture Khiva. They've got stuck in a blizzard, and the whole Russian force has been wiped out with only 10 survivors. So best of all worlds. You win and your enemies lose. And such is the overconfidence of the British at this point that there is sown the seeds of all the future worries for the future. The British don't go into the immensely well-fortified Bala Hissar up here. Instead, they just lay out their tents in the valley. In due course, some of the tents are replaced by barrack box. They build a little ditch around the outside, and in some places, it's not even finished, a palisade of wooden stakes. But as you can see from this picture, it's a completely indefensible position, surrounded on all sides by hills. A completely indefensible position, which of course is now occupied by the American embassy and the NATO barracks. And what happens next is that they gradually realize that it's, for all that it's a wonderful strategic asset, that it's an extremely expensive one to garrison. And this seems to be the key to Afghan history. It's not true that Afghanistan has never been successfully conquered or successfully ruled. All sorts of powers rule Afghanistan perfectly well from outside throughout Afghan history. The Mughals, the Timurids, all sorts of characters managed to keep the Afghans well ruled. What is difficult is the economics of it. It's extremely expensive to garrison Afghanistan. It's a drain on your treasury. And this is the point. It drains the East India Company. They have the profits of the opium and the tea trade disappear into Afghanistan, just as the Afghanistan drains the Soviet economy in the 1980s and is doing no favors to your balance of payments, even as we speak. Trillions of dollars pumped into Afghanistan. Because if you invade, just to take a random example, if anyone wants to invade Iraq, for example, not that anyone would do that, you can run off with the oil. If you invade the Punjab, as the East India Company will do soon. You can tax the farmers, you can tax the bazaris. But as Dost Muhammad Khan says of Afghanistan, it is a country that produces only men and stones. And it is an enormous drain on the country. So what do? They decide to train up an Afghan national army. Sound familiar, huh? I've forgotten the best one of these. Is that what does the British ambassador in Tehran say when he's trying to get support for this war on the run-up to it? His declaration is, we should declare that he who is not with us is against us. We must secure Afghanistan. So all these echoes. So they build a standing army and they begin to train up an infantry corps, but to pay for that they have to take lands away from the existing aristocracy. It's an old feudal system. The nobles provide cavalry in return for land. They remove many of those estates in order to pay for the standing army, and this stirs up the opposition in a way that the arrival of Shah Shuja and everything else had not stirred it up. The other thing they do is that because they're realizing the increasing costs, the accountants tell them to cut the costs, and they cut the subsidies that they paid to the Afridis and the Ghilzai and the border tribes. And this again is a huge mistake because there's a tradition in Afghanistan, there always has been, of paying radari, the road tax. You pay the tribes to keep the roads open. Aurangzeb used to pay this to the Afridis. Nadir Shah, going off to loot Delhi in 1739, pays it in both directions. You just pay the tribes. You don't mess with the Afridis. The positions like the Khyber Pass are just too strong. And you need to pay these guys to keep the road open. And they work for their money. They get the posts through, they stop brigands, they keep the roads safe for travelers and merchants. So Macnaghten summons in 1841, in the early autumn of 1841, he summons the Ghilzais to Kabul and tells them they're having their subsidies cut by 3/4. And this meets the immediate response that the following day the posts stop coming through. The British are stuck in Kabul. And the final thing which sets the Afghans against the British, there are many things. First of all, they don't like to see Shah Shuja turned into a puppet, or as they say in Dari, a muli, a radish. Most of all, the mullahs and the more conservative elements in their society don't like to see it. The British turned Kabul into one of those Friday nights in an English town where all the guys are pouring out of a pub, vomiting all over the streets, making a kind of raucous noises in all directions. The British squaddies are misbehaving. The sepoys are getting drunk. They're getting drunk publicly in the bazaars. Most of all, they're turning Kabul into an enormous brothel. There are 30,000 men at the peak, single men sitting in the cantonment, and more Afghan women are disappearing into the cantonment. This is something, incidentally, one of the few things that appears in all the different sources. It appears in the British papers, it appears in Shah Shuja's memoirs, it appears in even the epic poems, and it's a major issue. The Afghans do not like their women going off with these troops. So despite the fact that Shah Shuja has pulled his family up from Ludhiana to join him, despite the fact that Dost Muhammad Khan has come out of hiding and has surrendered himself to William Macnaghten in his top hat here, there's trouble brewing. And then the final straw is when Alexander Burns seduces this lovely lady, the girlfriend of Abdullah Khan at Chaksai. This is a big mistake. While all this is going on, the British are, all the Memsahibs are coming up from Calcutta. There's this huge movement to, the first years of the occupation are very, very calm. It isn't like there's an immediate resistance at all. First year, Lady Sale, the wife of one of the governors, comes up with her unmarried daughter, her grand piano, and the seeds from her garden in Agra. My sweet peas and geraniums were much admired, she writes in October. And in the kitchen garden, the potatoes especially thrive. There is cricket and horse racing and open-air amateur theatricals, and as winter draws in, snipe and duck shooting, skating and snowman building. The foxhounds are taken out daily to hunt jackals, and Alexander Burns throws a Christmas party with Scottish reels and bagpipes and presides over it all in Highland dress, complete with kilt and an enormous sporran. But all this goes to hell in a handcart when Burns goes off and starts sleeping with this girl. According to Mirza Atta Muhammad, is one of the best of all the Afghan accounts that I dredged up in Kabul, this is the moment that stirs up the beginning of the resistance. It happened by God's will, he writes, in November 1841, that a slave girl of Abdullah Khan Achakzai ran away from his house to the residence of Alexander Burns. When on inquiry that was found out where she had gone, the Khan, beside himself with fury, sent his attendant to fetch the silly girl back. But the Scotsman, swollen with pride, cursing and swearing, had the Khan's attendant severely beaten and thrown out the house. The Khan then summoned the other nobles and said, "Now we are justified in throwing off this English yoke. They stretch the hand of tyranny and dishonor private citizens great and small. Making love to a slave girl isn't worth the ritual bath that follows it, but we have to put a stop right here, right now. Otherwise," and this is my favorite sentence in the book, "otherwise these English will ride the donkey of their desires into the field of stupidity." To the point of having us all arrested. And I put my trust in God and raised the battle standard of our prophet. Better to die than live with degradation and dishonor. And the other nobles, his childhood friends, tightened their belts and girt their loins and prepared for jihad. So the initial thing is Burns is in bed with this girl upstairs when Abdullah Khan Achakzai turns up outside. It's rather like a familiar situation of some sort of student lodgings or something. But in this case, Abdullah Khan Achakzai burns down the house. Poor old Burns has to run out the back in his disguised as an Afghan, but he's spotted, cut down, his head is kicked around as a football, and the trunk of his body is put up on a meat hook in the bazaar. And initially, this is all that the uprising. It wasn't really an uprising. This was just Abdullah Khan Achakzai out to revenge his honor. But it snowballs, and because no one sends in any help from the bazaar, the thing begins to get worse. Old McNaughton goes out in his top hat and blue-tinted spectacles to negotiate, but he's shot dead by the Afghan negotiating party. The British are very bravely and sensibly put all their food and all their ammunition in two outlying forts that lie between the old city and the cantonment. They haven't bothered to bring it within the cantonment. So the Afghans, in the first 48 hours of the uprising, simply capture the food and capture the guns, and then haul the guns up on the hills above the cantonments and shell it. And you can see more clearly from this picture than any other I know, the fact that you can see how ragged this thing is. It's still tents. It's not even a kind of established cantonment. There's a few barrack blocks that have come up, but mainly it's just tents in a plain. And there's only the beginnings of an outside wall. It's a totally indefensible space. And having lost their food and having lost their ammunition, there's really not much the Brits can do. They eat the foxhounds. And after they've eaten the foxhounds, it's eating the horses, and after they've eaten the horses, they're screwed. And there's really nothing they can do. It's the middle of winter, the passes are blocked, there's no help coming from Kandahar, Jalalabad, or from British India, and they haven't got the food to see them out over the winter. Shah Shuja invites them up to the Bala Hissar, but for some bizarre reason they don't do it. They don't go and sit there. He has the food, he has a fortress, but they don't join him. They decide, very foolishly, to make a bid for breaking out and going back to India, joining up with Jalalabad. In the middle of winter. It is the coldest winter since for 20 or 30 years, and record blizzards, snowdrifts 7 or 8 feet tall in some of the passes. And the British general in charge is not up to much. This is William Elphinston. The only reason he got his job is he has very good grouse moors, which Lord Auckland wanted to shoot on when he gets back. They're old friends. He's riddled with gout. He hasn't seen action since Waterloo. He finally gets onto his horse. He falls off the horse falls on him, and that's the end of Elphinston. So there's not much to do but for these guys to pack their bags and head off home. And they do that on the 6th of January, 1842. And by this stage, thanks to troop cuts, and thanks to the fact that most of the, again, this is the sort of thing that would never happen today, the Brits take their eye off the ball and go off and invade another country, having invaded Afghanistan. In this stage, not Iraq, but the Opium War. The Opium War against China is declared in 1841, and half the regiments are pulled out to fight that. So when this uprising takes place, there's only 4,500 troops left in Kabul. And they are, of those, only 700 of those are regular British Army. The rest are these company sepoys from Bihar and UP who've never fought in snow, have no idea how to do winter warfare. But many of them never seen snow before. And at 9 a.m. on the 6th of January, 1842, they blow down the side of the cantonment and march out. Now, one of those on the retreat is my great-great-uncle, Sir Colin Mackenzie. And he writes a rather fantastic diary. He says, at 9 a.m., the troops moved off, a crouching, drooping, dispirited army, so different from the smart, light-hearted body of men that appeared some time ago, the men sinking a foot deep in the snow with each step. My heart sunk within me under the conviction that we were a doomed force. I always remember as one of the most heart-rending sights of that humiliating day, fixing my eyes by chance on a little Hindustani girl, perfectly naked, sitting in the snow, with no mother or father near her. She was a beautiful little girl, about 2 years old, just strong enough to sit upright, with her little legs doubled up underneath her, hair curling in waving locks around the soft little throat, and the great black eyes dilated to twice their normal size, fixed on the armed men, the passing cavalry, and all the strange sights that met her gaze. Many other children, as young as innocent, I saw slain on the road, and the women with their long dark hair wet with their own blood. The rear guard had to fight the whole way to Bagrami and pass through a literally continuous line of poor wretches, men, women, and children, dead or dying from cold or wounds, who, unable to move, entreated their comrades to kill them to put an end to their misery. Now, the British make the same mistake they made at the beginning of the uprising. They don't guard their commissariat. First out are the cavalry, then come the infantry, the baggage comes last, and the Ghazis just land on it, not out of brilliant strategic thinking, just because they want to loot the stuff. And so by the time that the cavalry have arrived at the first night of the camping site, they get off their horses and they're waiting for their dinner and waiting for their tents. The tents don't come up. The food doesn't turn up. 6 o'clock, it's dark, it gets cold, still no tents. By 10 o'clock, it's clear they're not coming. Now it's minus 20. Now the Afghans who are with the party know exactly what to do. They dig a circle in the snow, they build a fire in the middle, and they hunker down body to body with all their turbans and their cloaks and what have you out on top of them to keep them warm. And that way, it's not a very comfy night, but all their bits are still there when they wake up in the morning. But the poor old Biharis in the company seaboats haven't got a clue what to do in the snow, and they just lie down on the ice. And the following morning, they wake up to find that their fingers and their toes look like charred logs of wood. They've got frostbite. They can't even crawl. And at that point, Wazir Akbar Khan, who's leading the resistance, sends his cavalry up behind them, and they're driven into the Kabul Pass. Now, the Afghans have noticed that the British have this simple musket, the brown breast musket, which was the musket that won Waterloo, but it only fires about 300 yards. These guys have got their long-barreled Jazales, which the same sort of things you see Shah Jahan shooting deer with. It's technology 300 years old. They're clumsy, they're slow to load, it's heavy, but they fire about half a mile. So they just build their slit trenches 3/4 of the way up the mountains and wait for the British to file in. And the Kabul, even today, is incredibly narrow. You can only fit about 4 or 5 men abreast in some of the parts. They file in, they can't see anyone on the slopes. Then suddenly they start hearing this eerie, metallic, ringing noises echoing around the mountains. And they've no idea what it is. A noise so unmistakable in its character that it can never be forgotten by those whose ears have once been startled by its unfamiliar sound. What it is it's the ramrods of the Jazales packing these enormous powder charges in. They used 2 or 3 times the normal powder charges in these Giselles in order to fire these bullets this distance. And then the ambush is sprung. The confusion was fearful. This is Lady Sale, she of the grand piano, and the unmarried daughter. We had not proceeded half a mile when we were heavily fired upon. The pony my daughter rode was wounded in the ear and the neck. I fortunately had only 1 ball in the arm. 3 others passed through my cloak near the shoulder. The pass completely choked up, and for a considerable period we were stationary under heavy fire. The sepoys and camp followers, half frozen, tried to force their way not only into our tents but into our beds. The poor wretches, many poor wretches, died around the tent that night. Many women and children were abducted. My great uncle is at this point taken hostage and has to go back through the route of the ambush in reverse. He that evening describes seeing more bloody scenes, sepoys and camp followers being stripped and plundered on all sides, and such as refused to give up money or valuables were instantly stabbed and cut down. On seeing us, the poor creatures cried out for help, many of them recognizing me and calling me by name. But what could we do? The girls' eyes had now tasted blood and clearly showed their tigerish nature, becoming very savage and fierce in their demeanor towards us, demanding that we should be given up to them for sacrifice, brandishing long blood-stained knives in our faces and telling us to look upon the heaps of carcasses around us, for we should soon be among them. You came to Kabul for fruit, did you? How do you like it now? They cried. As we proceeded, we were met by numbers of the enemy's horse and foot, returning to Kabul, laden with plunder of all kinds. One miscreant had a little Indian girl seated on the horse beside him. So 18,500 men, women, and children leave the cantonment on the morning of the 6th of January. There's only about 15,000 of them that get through the Kabul Pass. They then go up into the Tezin Pass, where they get caught in the most enormous blizzard. On the way down, there's another major ambush. And finally, at the village of Jagdalik, the Ghilzais there erect a holly hedge covered in thorns to block their passage. There's an enormous panic. They hit it just after dusk at 7 a.m. The cavalry trample down the infantry. Only 200 get over the hedge. Those 200 men are exposed at dawn on the village of Gundamuk, on the hill above the village. And in this iconic scene, they fight until the last round. They fight on with bayonets, and they're all slaughtered except one man, Thomas Suter, who wraps the regimental colours around him and is taken hostage. Everyone else is killed. 15 cavalry make it onto the Nimla Gardens built by Shah Jahan. The gardeners offer them must and naan, yogurt and bread. And they get off their horses, they eat their breakfast, and they're clubbed to death by the gardeners. One man makes it through to Jalalabad that day. This is the assistant surgeon, Dr. Bryden. Dr. Bryden has rolled up in his forage cap his copy of Blackwood's magazine, which is the kind of New Yorker of its day. And when they have a go at him with their swords, it goes through the leather binding of Blackwood's magazine, but it doesn't go through his head, which is why you should always travel with a copy of the New Yorker on your head if ever you find yourself in modern Afghanistan. General Sale greets him and says, "Where is the army?" He says, "I am the army." That night they put up torches on the battlements and blow bugles, but no one comes in. One of the young officers on the battlement says, "A strong wind was blowing from the south, which set the bugles and the sound of the bugles all over the town. The terrible wailing sound I will never forget. It was a dirge for our slaughtered soldiers, and heard throughout the night, had an inexpressibly mournful and depressing effect." Meanwhile, the other hostages are being driven back through scenes of unbelievable horror. "We passed 200 dead bodies," writes Lady Sale, "many of them European, the whole naked, covered with large gaping wounds. As the day advanced, several poor wretches of Hindustanis, camp followers who'd escaped the massacre of the night before, made their appearance from behind rocks and within caves, where they'd taken shelter from the murderous knives of the Afghans and the inclemency of the climate. They had been stripped of all they possessed. and few could crawl more than a few yards on their hands and knees, being frostbitten in the feet. Here Johnson found 2 of his servants. One of them had his hands and feet frostbitten and had a fearful sword cut across one arm and a musket ball in his stomach. The other had his right arm completely cut off. Both were utterly destitute of covering and had not tasted food for 5 days. Wounded and starving, they set fire to the bushes and grass and huddled all together to impart warmth to each other. Subsequently, we heard that scarcely any of these poor wretches escaped from this defile, and driven to extremes of hunger, they sustained life by feeding off their dead comrades. There are about 5,000 sepoys who are taken away to the slave markets of Central Asia. The Uzbek slavers have a particularly gruesome way of dealing with their slaves. They stitch with a needle a horsehair rope through the clavicle of their captives and then tie it to their saddle, and your hands are tied behind your back. And that way you're dragged off, and it breaks the spirit almost immediately. If you don't keep up with the horse, you have your chest cavity ripped open. And 5,000 sepoys are carried off into captivity. And it is the survivors, those who escape from the slave markets, those who make it back to British India, who begin the 1857 mutiny. Subadar Bah Khan, one of the leaders of the 1857 uprising, the First War of Independence, was a survivor. It's also, incidentally, in cities where the Afghan accounts of this resistance are printed. There are 2 epic poems, the Jangname and the Akbarname. There is a whole variety of letters that are printed in, very significantly, Delhi, Lucknow, Kanpur, in the early 1850s. And these are the cities where that uprising begins. And it begins also specifically in the regiments where the sepoys were deserted by their officers in the snows of the Kabul Pass. So there is a direct link from this one to the next. But for the Afghans, this is the great national liberation struggle. What Yorktown is to you guys, what Trafalgar or the Battle of Britain is to the Brits, what the Salt March and Gandhi is to the Indians, what the Easter Rising is to the Irish, this is to the Afghans. And Wazir Akbar Khan, who leads the resistance, is the Washington, is the Michael Collins, is the Gandhi. Well, not the Gandhi, really, but anyway, he's the Nehru, maybe, I know, the Bose, shall we say. The main diplomatic area of Kabul is to this day named Wazir Akbar Khan. And Shah Shuja is widely regarded as a quisling of the West, which explains why his direct tribal successor as chief of the Populzai, a man named President Hamid Karzai, goes out of his way today to bite the hand that feeds him. When you read these extraordinary statements that Karzai makes, saying that he's going to join the Taliban and that he's had enough of American atrocities against his people and that the Americans are in league with the Taliban, all this rhetoric is vital for him, as he sees it, to distance himself from his backers. He's not a puppet, in his view. He needs to stress over and over again that he's an independent figure and that he is not like his forebear, which is why also the Taliban websites continually compare him to Shah Shuja. I don't recommend, if you don't want to be investigated by the CIA this particular week in Boston, to go looking at the Taliban websites, but they have some rather fancy ones, and many of them in English. And they have these regular press releases. And one 2 weeks ago said, we know that President Karzai was placed on the empty throne of Shah Shuja by the Americans, by the West. And it goes on like this. So this is what Karzai is having to defend himself against. But for the Afghans, this is their supreme moment of triumph. And they do it at the very peak of the British economic power. 1840 is more or less the high watermark of British dominance of world economy. After this comes the rise of Germany, then the rise of America, and the share of British world trade sinks down to its current level. But this is more or less the high point, the high watermark of this. And yet the Afghans, using old technology, managed not just to defeat the British, but to utterly annihilate an entire army. The Brits, incidentally, of course, can't take this without getting revenge. So the next year, they send up, when the snows have melted, their crack general, General Pollock. Pollock goes into Afghanistan. He gathers his troops very meticulously in Peshawar, waits until all his ammunition has arrived, does all the things that the generals didn't do the year before. And then he goes up. He cuts down every tree he comes to. He burns every field. He unroofs every house. He burns every village. And his final farewell to Afghanistan, having freed all the hostages, who've been very well looked after, incidentally, by Akbar Khan and given lots of food and given clothes and all the rest of it. His final act is to blow up the greatest building in Afghanistan, the Char Chatter Bazaar, built by Ali Mardan Khan, Shah Jahan's governor, in 1640. They dynamite it, and then they disappear off back to India. Was Dost Muhammad, who the war was fought to throw out. He's released from prison in Dehradun and told to go back. He meets Ellenborough in the Punjab, and a very simple agreement is agreed upon that he will be allowed to go back to Afghanistan if he promises not to interfere with Britain, and Britain promises not to interfere with Afghanistan. He goes back and he rules Afghanistan. He conquers the north of the country. He starts in just Kabul. He conquers Jalalabad, Ghazni, Kandahar, Kulm. By 1862, his last campaign is the capture of Herat. And at his death in 1862, Afghanistan more or less assumes its current contours on the map. And it's about this period that for the first time that the Afghans start to use the phrase Afghanistan. So in a sense, this war helps consolidate the concept of a country called Afghanistan. Whether this war begins the undoing of it, if the country goes into partition, which is not improbable, after the Americans withdraw in 2014, it will be a perfect binary of this one. One war creates the country, and the next Western intervention unravels it. But Dost Muhammad Khan, shown here, being celebrated by the Sikhs in Lahore on his way back, unites the entire country. Mirza Atta reflects the way that the story of victory, the story grows in the telling almost immediately. Only 2 years later, he's writing, "It is said that 60,000 English troops, half from Bengal, half from other provinces, without counting servants and camp followers, went to Afghanistan. And only a handful came back alive, wounded and destitute. And the rest fell with neither grave nor shroud to cover them, and lay scattered in that land like rotting donkeys. For the English love gold and money so much that they cannot stop themselves from laying hands on any area productive of wealth. But what prize did they find in Afghanistan, except on one hand the exhausting of their treasury, and on the other the disgracing of their army? It is said that 40,000 English troops had been in Kabul, and that many were taken captive en route. Others remained as cripples and beggars. The rest perished in the mountains, like a ship sunk without trace. For it is no easy thing to invade and occupy the kingdom of Khorasan. These English hoped to establish themselves in Khorasan to block any Russian advance. But for all the treasure they expended, for all the lives they sacrificed, the only result was ruin and disgrace. If the English had been able to take and keep Afghanistan, would they really have left this land where 44 different types of grape grow? And other fruit as well. Apples, pomegranates, rhubarb, mulberries, sweet watermelon and muskmelon, apricots and peaches. And ice water that cannot be found in all the plains of India. These Indians know neither how to dress nor how to eat. God save me from the fire of their dal and their miserable chapatis." So that's Mirza Atta signing off on India. So when I came to write this book, I thought there's two things I had to do. One was to try and find out the Afghan sources, because this is a much-told story, many, many books on this old chestnut, but always from the British point of view. And in the course of journeys to Kabul, Jalalabad, Herat, and Kandahar, I ended up with about, 9 accounts which I got from Afghanistan, one which turned up, oddly enough, in Delhi. 9 full-length Afghan accounts of this war. 2 epic poems, the Jangnama and the Akbarnama, written immediately after. One written from the court, which celebrates Wazir Akbar Khan. Another very interesting one from Charikar, from the Kohistan, which was found in a saddlebag in 1951, and was brought in to Ariana, the Afghan, the fantastic 1950s and 60s nationalist Afghan history journal, edited by Reshtia, who reprinted many of these accounts in the 1950s and 60s. And this gives the account from the Kohistan and celebrates the bravery of the Kohistanis, and particularly their Naqshbandi peers, who figure in this account as the leaders of the uprising. Wazir Akbar Khan hardly appears in this account at all. Nicely, it was written on English paper looted from the barracks in Charikar. So they used English paper to snipe at their occupiers. There is a full-length autobiography of Shah Shuja, written initially in his exile in Ludhiana and modeled on the Baburnama, but given a fantastic and very interesting postscript by one of his followers called Mohammed Hussain Herati, who writes a very sympathetic account of how the British undermined Shah Shuja and how they wrecked his rule by failing to give him his own command. There are letters from several of the Afghan resistance leaders, including Abdullah Khan Achakzai's military commander, Aminullah Khan Lugari. These have recently been reprinted in paperback in Dari in Kabul. And there are 4 or 5 later historical accounts based on earlier chronicles which are now lost, the largest of which, the Siraj al-Tawrikh, was recently published by Robert McChesney last month in a 2-volume account. So there's a whole range of rather amazing Afghan sources. Obviously, you can't use epic poetry in the same way as you'd use an East India Company bureaucratic account. If Lord Auckland writes to his commander-in-chief that he wants to move 2,000 sepoys from Barrackpore to Calcutta, the chances are that around 2,000 sepoys were moved from Barrackpore to Calcutta. If one of the epic poets writes that 1 million brave jihadis poured down on the English cantonment, you don't necessarily take that as a mathematical calculation. But they're fascinating in their record of attitudes towards the British, particularly the way they regard the British as almost a mirror image of Western ideas of the wicked, duplicitous Oriental, because the British are continually portrayed as sexually voracious, as duplicitous, and as deceitful. And Burns, in particular, is made out to be this sort of satanic figure, this deeply attractive, devious man who's always using money to lure people into the fires of hell. And so you get this fantastic counterpart of the sort of Orientalist stereotypes being used against the British by the Afghan poets. But the other thing I wanted to do when I was in Afghanistan was to retrace the route, because I thought you can't really write a book like this unless you really know the scenery. So as well as visiting all the places, I wanted to do particularly the route of the retreat. And that's easy enough in the early stages, but quite tricky over here by the end, by Gundamuk, because the hill in the background of this picture is none other than Tora Bora, site of another last stand. And it's now the very center of sort of Taliban territory, about 30 miles outside Jalalabad. And I had a lucky break because my second night in Kabul, I was hauled in by the head of Karzai's security, the head of the NDS, a man called Amrullah Saleh. And it turned out I wasn't being arrested. It turned out it was a rather bizarre literary critique by a secret policeman, which doesn't happen often. And he'd read The Last Mughal, and he didn't like it. And he thought I'd been far too easy on Bahadur Shah Zafar, who had no sense of patriotism at all. And so he said, "You're going to do a better job this time. I'm going to send you off to Gundamuk." And he said, the only way you're going to get there is this guy, Anwar Khan Jagdalik, who was the local warlord in that area. And he'd just come into the Karzai government, former Hezbi Islami Mujahideen commander, who was also the captain of the Afghan Olympic wrestling team in the last Olympics. And he's about 18 foot wide by 10 foot tall. He's the most enormous moving mountain of a man. And we set off with all his mudge in these bumping over on these Toyotas, past the site of the cantonment, now the American embassy inevitably. And we arrived eventually through the Kabul Pass, up the Tezin Pass, down the bottom to Jagdalik, where the holly hedge was put up. And there suddenly we got no further, not because of any trouble, but because all his tribespeople wanted to throw this enormous feast for him. And so sheep were killed, fires were lit, kebabs were cooked, chapli kebabs fried, all the usual stuff, mulberry pulao, course after course of this stuff. We were all sitting on carpets in an apricot grove, and on more and more food turning up for hours on end. And by about 4 o'clock, it was quite clear we were never actually going to get to Gundamuk. And it just wasn't going to happen that day. And so rather, like many others in Afghanistan before, I retired, retreated, defeated, and made it, had to go back via Sarobi, the main road to Jalalabad, where we discovered that, in fact, I had an incredibly lucky break, because that morning, after months of perfect peace in Gundamuk, that morning the government had come out to burn the poppy crop. And previous year they'd done this, they'd promised compensation, the visitors had the villagers had let them burn the crop, and the compensation never turned up. Some official pocketed it on the way, in the way that these things happen in Afghanistan. And the villagers said, if you do it next year, we're going to resist, and they did. And the morning that we were bumping off past the American embassy, the government arrived in the village, and they were shot up by the villagers. 9 police vehicles were destroyed, about 90 police captured, and several people killed. Said we turned up with our merry band of Hezbi Islami Mujj with all our guns and stuff at 4 in the afternoon, burping from this enormous meal. I probably wouldn't be standing here before you now. But the next day, there was, by pure good fortune, a jirga, and the elders came in because they had all these hostages, and they wanted to negotiate with the government. They had the hostages, and if they got their compensation, they'd give them back. And Jagdalik, as the local warlord, was called in to help negotiate, and so I went along. And we had this extraordinary day where the elders negotiated with the government, with Jagdalik as the go-between. And as this went on, there was this incessant, very sinister succession of drones taking off from Jalalabad airport. Jalalabad is the main center of the drone operations. And in those Bourne movies and so on, it's always one drone. But it's like a sort of London taxi rank, this one. These things taking off one after another. Strange, rather sinister, almost totally silent craft, and circling our jirga. Anyway, at the end, Jagdalik brought up the elders from Gundamuk, the successors of the guys who killed off this lot, and said, these are the guys that captured your great uncle. And we had this discussion. And I said, do you see any parallels? I said, parallels? They said, it's exactly the same. Both times the foreigners have come here for their own interests, not for ours. They say, we are your friends, we want to help, but they're lying. Whoever comes to Afghanistan, even now, they will face the fate of Burns and McNaughton. And this was what's so extraordinary, is that no one in Britain today remembers the names of Burns and McNaughton, completely forgotten historical figures. No one in India. No one in America has ever heard of them in the first place. But every Afghan knows these names. They know about Wazir Akbar Khan. The way they look at Karzai is entirely determined by their reading of this history. There are a few details that are muddles. When you talk to the villagers, some of them muddle up the Second and the Third Afghan wars, and it all becomes one great sort of jihad against the West. But in general, these are well-known names, and these are universally known stories. We are the roof of the world, said one of the Gundamuk elders. From here, you can control and watch everywhere. Afghanistan is like a crossroads for every nation that comes to power. But we do not have the strength to control our own destiny. And then one of the elders told me a story. He said, last month, some American officers called me to a hotel in Jalalabad for a meeting. One of them asked me, "Why do you hate us?" And I replied, "Because you blow down our doors, you enter our houses, you pull our women by the hair, and you kick our children. We cannot accept this. We will fight back. And when we will fight back, and we will break your teeth. And when your teeth are broken, you will leave, just as the Russians and the British left before you. It's just a matter of time." What did he say to that, I asked. He turned to his friend and said, "If the old men are like this, what will the younger ones be like?" In truth, all the Americans here know their game is over. It's just their politicians who deny it. "This is the last days of the Americans," he said. "Next, it will be China." Thank you very much. Keys always go over time.
Yeah. The thing is, you want people to buy your book. You want people to buy your book, however.
Number 22 of the New York Times.
I saw that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Homi.
That was history, performance art, oratory, rhetorical magnificence, Hollywood, Bollywood. Really quite remarkable. This should be a Gen Ed course. I wanted to introduce our two commentators. Sugata Bose is Gardiner Professor of Oceanic History and Affairs. I don't quite know, in the light of your talk, how to interpret this, but Professor of Affairs at Harvard. His recent books include His Majesty's Opponent, Subhash Chandra Bose and India's Struggle Against Empire, and 100 Horizons, the Indian Ocean in the Age of Global Empire. Maya Jasanoff is Professor of History at Harvard. She's the author of Edge of Empire, Lives, Culture and Conquest in the East, 1750 to 1850, and Liberty's Exiles, American Loyalists in the Revolutionary War. Thank you both very much for agreeing to be with us. And before I turn to Sugata, can I ask you, master of detail, what happened to the woman?
Which woman?
The slave
Lady-
woman?
Abdullah Khan Achakzai's
Yes.
girlfriend. She was killed too.
Thank you.
What happened to Lady Sale, I thought? I should just add.
No, I was much more interested in the woman who
But no, she's
started
lovely.
the whole thing.
Lady Sale's a good story. Lady Sale becomes a circus act. Astley Circus puts on Lady Sale's exploits. Lady Sale, at the end, when she's one of the hostages, she breaks out and she grabs some of the guns. And none of the men who've been kept hostage for 9 months and sort of turned into sort of not vegetables, but sort of lost their will to resist. And she said, "Do I have to do this all by myself?" And finally, the men pick up the guns. And her husband is killed in the Sikh Wars. She goes off as a widow to South Africa, Cape Town, and she has my favorite epitaph from this era on her grave. "Here lies all that could die of Lady Sale."
Sugata, you have written stories about very excitable times, histories of very excitable times too. Well, let's have your view.
Well, this should be an audio book if it's not one already. What you've heard, friends, is an abridged version of a riveting narrative of the First Anglo-Afghan War that unfolds expansively in a monumental book, The Return of a King. In his talk, Will chose to end with the retreat to Jalalabad. But after the catastrophic retreat from Kabul to Jalalabad in the winter of 1841-42, Will suggests towards the end of the book, it became necessary to make a defeat look like a victory. Ellenborough, who had replaced Auckland as Governor General of India, ordered William Knott to bring back from Ghazni the gates of Mahmud of Ghazni's tomb, which he was said to have looted from the temple at Somnath in 1026, and also the mace with which he was reputed to have smashed the idol of Shiva. The apocryphal mace could not be found, but the gates were unhinged from the tomb and brought back across the river Sutlej. Ellenborough claimed in his bombastic proclamation of the gates of November 1842 that this was a glorious trophy of successful war. The residents of Ghazni wept, and the Hindus and Muslims of India were quite indifferent to Ellenborough's claim to have avenged a humiliation of 800 years vintage. Will mentions this in his book. What he does not talk about is the partisan politics that played out in London in much the same way as it does in Washington these days. In March 1843, Macaulay excoriated Ellenborough in Parliament for betraying his own religion in order to pay honor to an idol. The great majority of the population of India are idolaters, Macaulay bellowed. In no part of the world has a religion ever existed more unfavorable to the moral and intellectual health of our race. Lingaism, he added with searing sarcasm, is not merely idolatry, but idolatry in its most pernicious form. Ellenborough was reeling from such attacks from his ungrateful compatriots when it was discovered that the doors of Mahmud's tomb were not the gates of Somnath. Those gates were made of sandalwood. The timber of these was deodar. The inscriptions and decorations supplied clinching evidence that the gates were not of Indian origin. They were then abandoned in a corner of Agra fort as Ellenborough's folly. Now, in his book, particularly in the afterword and in today's talk, Will has pointed to the striking similarities between the First Afghan War and the fourth being waged since 2001. One of the questions that I would like to pose is how we can evoke the contemporary relevance and resonance in an historical work without sliding into an excess of presentism. Of course, Will does it extraordinarily well in his book. I mean, he holds back from saying anything explicit until the very end. But it occurred to me, is the shared tribal affiliation of Shah Shuja and Hamid Karzai, for example, much more than a remarkable coincidence? Of course, he's remembered in a certain way, as Will has just described to us. But did their Ghilzai enemies have an uninterrupted history of being drawn to the more orthodox and rigid forms of Wahhabi Islam? There is a case for drawing analogies between historical and contemporary events. I have done so myself in the book that Homi just mentioned, 100 Horizons, by seeing the First World War in the Middle Eastern theater as the first Gulf War of the 20th century, with lessons mostly unlearned by policymakers for the West's involvement in Iraq during the late 20th and early 21st centuries. But for any meaningful lessons to be drawn, as I will argue in a moment, the uncanny resemblances need to be set against the sobering differences in temporal context and the nature of global empire. Another question relates to the choice of the First Afghan War, rather than the second, let's say, in seeking to make comparisons with the contemporary predicament. The second of the three Anglo-Afghan wars was fought between 1878 and 1882 at the high point of what historians used to call the age of new imperialism that began around 1870. This was the period of the scramble over Africa and the conquest of much of Southeast Asia. The Second Afghan War began disastrously for the British with the massacre of the garrison in their residency at Kabul. But then General Frederick Slay Roberts turned the tide in 1880 at the Battle of Kandahar, where the Gordon Highlanders deployed the new Gatling gun to great effect. These were not the muskets of Waterloo anymore, but the new Gatling guns with more mobile and with a greater range. There were no drones in those days. And yet it proved impossible in the 1880s for the British to maintain tight control over Afghanistan, as the tribal fighters, armed with the same long flintlock Jazail that Will showed you, harried and hassled the invaders throughout the 1880s. Now, the inability to occupy Afghanistan at a time of territorial conquests elsewhere surely held portents for the future that may not have been as evident at the time of the first Afghan war. Now, the third in the series of Afghan wars took place during the aftermath of the First World War. It was a minor skirmish by comparison with the first two, but it too taught a sad lesson, not so much to the British, but to anti-colonial nationalists. As Aisha Jalal has shown in her book, Partisans of Allah, the call to hijrat, or migration, given by figures like Maulana Azad to Indian Muslims, hijrat is the alternative to jihad, turned out to be an unmitigated disaster as tribal predators fell upon their hapless co-religionists as they tried to migrate to a Darul Islam. Most grand theories of modern empire have drawn on the period of so-called new imperialism in the late 19th century. Now, given that background, I think it's important that Will has chosen to focus on an episode of imperial misadventure in the early Victorian era. There was for a long time a mistaken impression that the middle decades of the 19th century were a period of non-imperialism, if not anti-imperialism, and most of the forward movement took place in the later period. So what then drove the process of empire building in the middle decades of the 19th century, if the Russian bogey was no more than a pretext for aggression in Afghanistan? What else was going on in the British Empire at that historical moment? Now, if we reflect on that question, we might be a bit skeptical of Will's claim regarding the scale of the debacle that Afghanistan 1842 represented for the British Empire. It was a deeply humiliating military defeat, as Will has just sort of described to you, but it may not have had terribly bad strategic consequences. After all, between 1839 and 1842, the British conquered Sindh, and Charles Napier reputedly sent back the message in Latin, "Peccavi, I have sinned," and the British began the incorporation of Baluchistan into the British Raj. By 1849, after two Anglo-Sikh wars, the British had taken Punjab. That was to become the chief military recruiting ground for the British Indian Army after 1857. And the Kohinoor diamond, which Ranjit Singh had taken from Shah Shuja, was pocketed by the British and eventually found its place in the crown of Queen Victoria. In 1851-52, the Second Anglo-Burmese War resulted in the conquest of Lower Burma. And of course, as Will has already mentioned, it was precisely during the years of the First Anglo-Afghan War, 1839 to 1842, that another major imperial war was waged. Will suggests that it took attention away from Afghanistan. It prevented the possibility of further reinforcements being sent to the northwestern frontier. But the Opium War, from a British imperial perspective, was a remarkably successful war, which ended with the Treaty of Nanking in August of 1842. The Chinese were forced to cede sovereignty over Hong Kong and give extraterritorial privileges to the British in four treaty ports. So the British Empire, it seems, was able to absorb the price of the 18,500 troops lost in Afghanistan, especially when so many of them were mercenary Indian sepoys from Bihar and what is today eastern UP. That sort of where Will has a point about the long-term or the medium-term strategic consequences of the defeat in Afghanistan is that these Afghan accounts and chronicles and memoirs that were written in the 1840s and the 1850s were printed in India, circulated in India. It spread the message that the British were not invincible and certainly contributed to the great 1857 rebellion. But otherwise, if you look at what else was going on in both the near abroad of India and as far afield as China, the British seem to have actually gained some ground in the immediate aftermath of this debacle in Afghanistan. And this leads me to finish with a comment on the contemporary situation. In the middle of the 19th century, there was the British Empire, and there was this one other great land empire, the Russian Empire. There was the ailing Ottoman Empire, a dysfunctional Qing Empire in China. India was completely prostrate, especially after Wellesley had defeated Mysore and the Marathas. But if you look at the worldwide context today, we see a resurgent China, a vibrant Southeast Asia, India trying to emerge as a very major regional, if not a global power. And therefore, it seems to me that an ill-conceived involvement in Afghanistan and a shambolic withdrawal in 2014 might in fact have greater strategic consequences for the United States of America than the military debacle in Afghanistan in 1842 had for the British Empire in the middle part of the 19th century. I don't see any other sort of place across the Asian continent or the Indian Ocean where the United States would be able to recover its losses in the way that the British seemed to be able to in the 1840s and the early 1850s.
Thank you, Sugata. Very, very carefully considered responses to which we will return both to the sort of the rise of the East issue now, as well as the notion of historical analogies and comparisons. But your reflections, Maya.
So listening to Sugata, one thing that I'm thinking of is that one of the great strengths of the British Empire was its ability to take defeats and turn them into victories. And of course, the little ships at Dunkirk would fit into exactly the same narrative. But I guess I was prompted to try to situate Willie's book and talk within three contexts. And I guess you could think of these three each as questions of a sort. And in a couple of respects, they may dovetail with Sugata's remarks. The first one concerns how the Afghan war did fit with contemporaneous British imperial endeavors. And here I'm thinking less, I think, about other British military expansionist efforts and more of what is in this period really the kind of high water mark of early British liberalism and the Age of Reform, so-called. And I wonder how the experience in Afghanistan inflects our understanding of this era, the 1830s and 40s in particular, as a liberal age and an age of reform. And when you describe the context, the causes for the war more generally, you point, I think very rightly, to this issue of Russophobia, and you target the hawks. At the same time, in the bigger political context of this period, the hawks are a relatively small group of people, and the air of the age is very much oriented toward reform. So you have the abolition of slavery, for example, in 1833. You have, in fact, at the very moment, more or less, that the invasion force is crossing the Indus, you have the Earl of Durham presenting his report to the British government on the state of the colonies in North America, which is a reform for Canada that actually ends up providing the template ultimately for home rule, which will circle back around to India in due course. You have also the ascent of free trade policy, which, of course, the Opium War is an early harbinger of. And so, you know, I think perhaps that's where the answer may begin to reside, which is that many of these British liberal messages actually come at gunpoint, one way or another. But I do wonder how this sense of a sort of aggressive East India Company state, British state, that you give us so vividly squares with the image of liberalism that we otherwise have. The second context and question that I wanted to raise also dovetails a bit with Sugata's point about the contemporary relevance of this story today. You were telling me earlier today that you signed a book over for President Obama today. And I asked Willie what inscription he put in the book. And he said, "I wish I had written this book 10 years earlier." And I wonder, the question that raises, of course, is how you would have written the book differently had you written it 10 years earlier. But I'm thinking in particular about two areas where I see perhaps fewer similarities and more divergences between the current situation and the one that you describe. The first one will maybe resonate with people in this room who have done their reading in post-colonial studies, including our esteemed host here, and that is that the portrayal of the self-image of the British imperially very much emphasized, particularly by the later 19th century, this idea that they were going to be stepping into imperial settings in order to raise the status of the subjects that they encountered, particularly women. And this leads Gayatri Spivak to make the comment that the British portrayed themselves as being white men stepping in to save brown women from brown men. And this is very much a kind of imagery that is in use today, it seems to me. And shortly after the invasion back in 2001, of course, what did we see in the media? We saw pictures of unveiled women in Afghanistan. So it seems to me there's a real imperial parallel there. And yet it's very much at odds with the one that you mentioned, which is fascinating, which is that it was actually the British mistreatment of women in Afghans' eyes that led to the turn on them. And so in fact, the Afghan war, as you describe it, or at least the uprising, is about brown men saving brown women from white men. And it's quite an inversion. Similarly, there's an interesting inversion, I think, around this issue of destruction and preservation. So what the British do in 1842 is to go into Afghanistan and, as part of the Army of Retribution, exercise their retributive justice against the very cityscape that had been so hostile to them. And what do? They blow up the bazaar. What has America done more recently, again building, I think, on a later British imperial precedent, but make a point of preservation. And the Bamiyan Buddhas, the explosion of the Bamiyan Buddhas, of course, was an early harbinger of what was to come, I think, in Western perceptions of Afghanistan. And now, of course, there's lots of efforts to try to reconstruct some Afghan heritage under Western sponsorship. So anyway, these were a couple points of divergence. The final point that I wanted to think about here, the final context and question, concerns how this history fits within your oeuvre as a writer. It seems to me this is the third history you've written, and it forms part of what I would see as a trilogy. I wonder how you would respond, in which White Moguls, Willie's book about late 18th century Brits in India, who go native in a period of much greater sort of cross-cultural understanding. We see in this book kind of the last of the White Moguls dying off, Ochterlony and others. At the end, I'm struck at how many of your images show British men in Oriental garb. And you then give us here the foreshadowing of your most recent history book, The Last Mogul, history of the Indian Mutiny in Delhi, and of course, as you point out, which I think is fascinating, it is these very regiments that will go on to lead it. So 3 history books, all of them, I think, connected. But what about the way that this fits with your travel writing? You tell us very vividly at the end about your journey through the passes. And I wonder if maybe, I imagine many in the audience would be interested to know how you do connect your work as a travel writer and your traveling through the footsteps with the recreation of a historical setting. And with that, I'll conclude just to remark that, certainly for me, as a historian who's had the privilege of reading your work and seeing it take shape over the years, the sense that you give us of traveling back into the past remains a continuing source of inspiration.
Thank you very much, Maya. Of course, one of the issues is that whether it was white men saving brown women from brown men, or brown men saving white women, brown women from white men, the fact is that women are always commodities. They're commodities of power. It doesn't make a difference whether you say you hate Sati or you don't hate Sati. The issue is the woman is the commodity there, in a power game, in a chess game. So I think the question of gender, frankly, is a very cynical is a very cynical issue there. It's not really about gender. It's about different forms of subjecthoods, using them one against the other. But I thought, we've got a wonderful set here of questions. There's splendid response from both our guests. Why don't we do this? Why don't we take the question of, your question of 19th century liberalism and the war, and then move on, Willie, if you would, to Sugata's question of the kind of neoliberal moment now and how you would reflect back on the war. So let's take the two liberalisms, the 19th century liberalism and the 21st century neoliberalism, and the two different wars, and let's do a little bit of cross-hatching here.
No, I think this idea of armed liberalism is a very intriguing one, and one of the things that you get in this story is how the self-image of the West is so often at odds with its reality on the receiving end. One of the most fascinating things in these Afghan accounts is the way that the British are regarded as women-abusing terrorists, and I use both those words carefully. That, as we've already discussed, the Afghan, one of the principal grouses against the Brits was the mistreatment of women, the very reverse of our image of going to save the poor Afghan women. I did this same presentation with Spivak in Colombia 2 days ago, and she raised exactly this point to order. And but very particularly, the Afghan epics contain a very interesting divergence on the whole business of civilian casualties. And they regard the British as being as breaking the codes of ethics of war, to have inflicted so many civilian casualties. There's a particular moment in the Jangname where Mir Masjidi, the local leader from Charikar, goes to give himself in and goes to the tomb of Timur Shah in Kabul to give himself in. And while he's there, the British destroy his fort and kill his women and children. And there's this long series of couplets, which I had given in the book, where they say the terror of the British killing the innocent, going out deliberately to frighten us into submission, and how we won't stand for this, how we won't allow ourselves to be cowed. Exactly the rhetoric that we use today in the face of stuff like the Boston bombing, but inverted in a sense, given voice in the opposite way.
And when they, if I might just ask you, when they fought amongst themselves, did they preserve these high ethical standards?
Certainly there seems to be a surprise at the willingness of the British to kill civilians. And it was fighting men against fighting men. This is certainly the ethical setup presented in the epics, whether in reality...
That's my question.
Yeah, whether it ever actually... I mean, I can't answer whether they actually were angels in warfare. One doubts they were, but certainly that they felt that the British were transgressing moral norms in Afghanistan.
Yeah. No, I'm just wondering whether it's tribal war, whether you had tribal armies as opposed to tribal civilians, or whether there was the distinction was much less clear. But, that's another question.
But, I mean, as for the consequences, I think if 1857 is partly the echo of what happens in the aftermath of this war, I think the obvious what's the phrase they use? Blowback. The blowback from this war has to be Pakistan, because the most terrible effect of the drones and the losses in Afghanistan is going to be what happens next in Pakistan. I gave this presentation in Lahore at the Lahore Literary Festival, and what was most striking was the virulent anti-Americanism of the young English-speaking, university-going liberal elite in Lahore. You expect the beards and the rural Islamists and the veil, but these were all kids who were trying to get to Harvard.
And if you see
at an English language literary festival,
and if you see the end of
and they were cheering.
I just want to. If you see the end of the reluctant fundamentalist, that's the point at which it
exactly
goes.
the same point. Makes exactly the same point. And Pakistan is comprehensively radicalized, both in the sense of the Islamists and the liberals. No, the drones have been the most counterproductive thing that America could have done. It turned the whole of Pakistan against. And if there is to be an equivalent to the 1857 next, it's not going to be in Afghanistan, nor is it going to be anywhere else. It's going to be in Pakistan. And that's what I fear. I fear that that's the most disastrous consequence of this war.
What about the historical analogy? To take it a little further, do you think Sugato's account of the recovery of the British and you traced a different history?
I thought it was very interesting. Yeah. I hadn't thought of that at all, and I think he's right. I mean, it is true that despite this disaster, what follows is another major period of expansion, and the conquest of the Punjab is a hugely profitable and successful operation. And then in 1857, the Punjab doesn't go up. Punjab remains loyal, weirdly, although it's only been conquered 10 years earlier.
But of course, it's the Hindustani sepoys who are sent to conquer Punjab.
And then when the even more so in the army which is raised to attack Delhi in September 1857, not only is it the largely Sikh army that captures Delhi, it's Sikhs with these guys from what we would call Fatah now. It's the Waziris. And they line up to volunteer to have a go at the sepoys in Delhi to get their revenge. And so there is a direct thing there. There's a wonderful lines by Rawlinson, who is this great Oriental scholar, who not only knows all the ancient Persians, but he is the man, ironically, who's made to detach the gates. And he knows immediately, he can read all the inscriptions.
And Rawlinson knew it.
Clearly Arabic. Yes, there's no way that this is anything to do with Gujarat in the 7th century. He says immediately, this is 12th century. And he said that the mullahs at the gate said, what the hell do you want with these things? Of course you can take them. They're nothing no use to us. And they're still sitting in Agra. They're in the ASI have them rotting away in some poor corner. We must give it back. Get the ASI to return it to Ghazni. Next year, Ghazni is to be a big UNESCO celebration of the architecture of Ghazni, and they've done some incredible restoration work in Ghazni over the last 6 months. When we were in Kabul 3 weeks ago, I met one of the Italians who'd been working in Ghazni. This would be a fantastic gesture from India to
return the doors of the tomb.
They should return them to Cairo.
Yes.
Did you want to ask something else or respond?
One thing I haven't mentioned, which I think might be interesting, is that talking about being in Afghanistan 2 weeks ago, we were summoned, more or less, to Afghanistan by Karzai, who'd been given a copy of this book when it came out in India. And he read it within a week. And apparently when, I just heard this morning, when he met Obama, he was chatting away about Shah Shuja to Obama, who didn't know who Shah Shuja was. And Karzai is completely obsessed with this story. He is very worried about his legacy. And he thinks that he's determined not to make the mistakes that Shuja made. He was very explicit about this. And so, in a sense, the strange thing is that we've forgotten all this history. The West doesn't know any of it and has forgotten it completely. But the one person who seems to be trying to learn from history is Karzai, who wants to make sure he's never regarded as a puppet and will never be seen as a quisling. And so expect more
invective. Do you want to take on a name?
I would imagine there's lots of questions in the audience.
Sugata, do you want to say anything in response?
I think the audience has been very patient and they probably want to ask a few questions.
Let's open up.
I think you should go for it, excepting that what Bill hasn't mentioned in his talk, it's in his book, Shah Shuja was assassinated. So there's reason to be worried if you're being compared to Shah Shuja, not just because of your of how you're going to be remembered in history, but what.
Shah Shuja, what was interesting about his assassination was it wasn't one of the enemies who was assassinated. No. It was an internal family dispute. It was his godson a guy called Shuja named after him, who hadn't been honored by Shuja. Instead, one of that man's family servants, ex-servants, had been honored. And it was a fit of pique. It wasn't, weird enough, anything at all to do with the main issues.
Has Karzai been good to his family?
Well, one of the weird things this week is we spent a week with the Karzais. It's like sort of wandering onto the set of The Godfather. And they said, Karzai wants his brother Qayyum to succeed. And Qayyum used to run a restaurant here, Helmut. Still right, yeah. And he was going on about how he'd succeeded. He came here with no money and succeeded because of the quality of his French-style service. And on this stuff went. And then there's the other brother, Mahmood, who's got all sorts of dodgy property deals in Kandahar. And it is. Who, do you remember from The Godfather? Who's the dumb brother who gets caught in the ambush?
Fredo.
Yeah,
Fredo.
and shot at the toll gate. Yeah, he's Mahmood.
Sunny.
Questions? Yes. Thank you. Just you'll get a mic in a second.
Right. Thanks to the panelists. My name is Karl Forsberg. I was in Afghanistan for a year in Kabul, living actually in Wazir Akbar Khan, working for the four-star NATO headquarters, doing a lot of Afghan politics and counter-corruption work. And I think there's a fascinating parallel as well towards the fact that ultimately what undid the British occupation was cutting back on the subsidies. The flow of money really was key. But stepping back to some of the broader questions raised about historical parallels, I'm wondering, just to sort of put a completely new spin on the historical parallels, if you think of who actually is the successor of Britain's policy, the British Empire's policy in Pakistan, which evolves, of course, over time. The British realize they need to be more indirect in exerting influence in Kabul. They realize it's best ultimately to have a friendly client whose foreign policy they control.
My dear friend, if you just ask the question, it would be easier to answer it, and then you can come back and have a discussion.
Sure, okay. To what extent is Pakistan, Rawalpindi today, the real successor of the British Afghanistan policy?
Well, it's very intriguing that after Ranjit Singh dies in 1839, as the Khalsa begins to disintegrate, and you have these series of sort of rebellious chiefs in different parts of the Punjab, you get, even then, in the same cities as today, Afghan rebels against the British taking shelter in Peshawar and training in the same valleys, in a sense, where the Taliban are training today. And there are direct parallels in the way that the disintegrating Khalsa, a military, which is itself a military junta in a sense, is run by the generals in the same way that it is generals in Rawalpindi, Lahore, and Peshawar who are arming and helping the Afghan rebels in 1841. So there is a direct parallel between what's going on in Pakistan there and now. Whether the Pakistanis represent the Brits, I'm not so sure, but it's an interesting idea. I'll mull on that one.
Any other questions? Yes, right.
So your last book was The Last Mughal, and from there you decided to take on Afghanistan. Why did you decide to take on this topic and this specific war?
It's very much the same world. I mean, Maya talked about a trilogy, and I do think this is a trilogy. It's 70 years of East India Company history. White Moguls opens in 1795 and closes in 1805. One of the young Henry Russell, who's one of the main characters in that, is the mentor of William McNaughton with the top hat and the blue tinted spectacles. And as we've seen, the sepoys who survived the retreat from Kabul open the uprising in 1857. So there's characters who flow from one book to the other, and they are very much a threesome. Why did I do this book? I think it's partly, I mean, like many people, I first came to this in the pages of Peter Hopkirk's Great Game, which is one of the great popular histories It's I know you're a great fan of it. It's a flawless work of narrative. I mean, it's very, very dated in tone now, and very full of sort of devious Orientals and brave Brits. But as a work of sort of introduction to this whole world, it remains unparalleled. And then just seeing how the stories from that book were reproducing themselves in daily news. And it just seemed, I mean, it was very much that it just seemed to be the moment to have a go at this again. And the book immediately before this was actually a book called 9 Lives. And it was while I was on the end of the 9 Lives tour. You mentioned going around with this prison warder who's believed to be a reincarnation of Vishnu and the Sufis and the Baals. The last gig we did in that world tour was in Lahore. And it was while I was there that I went to look at the Punjab archives, which is the most romantic archive you can ever work in anywhere in the world. It's built in Anarkali's tomb. It's in, the documents are contained in the tomb that Jahangir is supposed to have built for when he came to power for the dancing girl his father is supposed to have walled up. And there is certainly a marble tomb that's meant to be Anarkali's, where you actually sit with your desks. And it's the most wonderful place to work I've ever worked. I played her Madhubala in Mughal-e-Azam on my laptop. I thought she should hear it, so she should know what was. And it was that day coming across the Claude Wade archive in that, which is beautifully catalogued. Another great thing about this archive is because no Americans go to Pakistan anymore, there's virtually no researchers ever. I've never seen another researcher there ever, in all the times I've been. And it contains, it contains the entire records, also Ranjit Singh's court. Anyone wanting to write about Ranjit Singh can just go there and spend 5 years wading through this fabulous stuff. And when I was sitting in that tomb that day, seeing that the entire Spy Master's archive was there, including huge amounts in Persian, made me certain that it was worth having another go doing the story, because there was clearly going to be a lot of the Dari and Urdu stuff untouched, and it would be worth having a go at it.
William, you said that some of the sources you used had not been used before in the Anglophone histories. What about historians?
Very important point. Both with this book and with Last Mughal, I've been using sources which are in no way new at all to historians working in Dari with this book or in Urdu with the last book. There is a wonderful biography of Bahadur Shah Zafar written in Urdu in Delhi by a man called Parvez Aslam, which uses all the mutiny papers I used in Delhi. But what you have both in India and in Afghanistan is this strange sensation of 2 parallel train tracks. The scholars working in English use only English sources, and there's a whole web of self-referential material that goes up that train track. And then you have the Urdu wallahs or the Dari historians who use only the Urdu or the Dari sources of what's been translated into Urdu or Dari. And these 2 train tracks almost never come together at any station. And if you just go and do what any historian would do anywhere else in the world, no one would dream of writing about Stalingrad without using both the Soviet and the Nazi archives. It just wouldn't happen. But for some reason in South Asia and Central Asia, there is this tendency only to use one set of materials. And it's a very simple trick to just bring these 2 together and see what happens.
Could I ask, Will, the 8 sort of Afghan accounts that you were able to lay your
10.
hands on,
Yeah.
10, did they tell you more about the memory of the war? Were you able to glean much from the Afghan sources about the actual course of the war? Or was it written in a style, the epic poems, as you say, would have exaggerations in terms of 1 million people descending from a hill and so forth?
No, I think what's important about both the 2 epic poems is that they're written immediately after. They are 1843 and 1844. They're in the immediate aftermath. So it isn't legends growing. And so while they're unreliable in all sorts of ways, they are extremely insightful. In other words, and I suppose the most important thing they show is how ignorant the British were of who their enemies were. You have a very a British perception, I suppose, that it's a united uprising, that you have a ring of bearded fanatics out to get the good guys is the kind of British perception. In reality, what's completely clear from the very tribally variegated Afghan sources is that the resistance isn't united at all. The thing kicks off not because of a plot, but because Abdullah Khan Achakzai wants to kill Burns for running off with his girlfriend. And that there's no preparation at all. It just kicks off that night for that reason and snowballs from that because the British don't put it down. Suddenly people realize that they have an option. And what you have very clearly in the Afghan sources is completely different camps of people. So you get the Kohistanis turn up and they camp in the village of Bemaru, and they're doing their thing up there, led by Mir Masjidi. You have the royalists who are in the old city, who want to keep Shah Shuja in power but want to get rid of the British and think they're doing it for Shah Shuja. You get the Barakzais who turn up slightly late, who are camped in the Shahbag near the cantonment, and thereafter.
And this is
thing.
Dost Muhammad's clan.
This is Dost Muhammad's clan,
yeah.
And they're after. And this is totally invisible in the British sources. You don't get this thing, and it's completely clear in the Afghan sources. So you have 4 or 5 completely different groups, each after different ends, who are all willing to have a go together and possibly fight together. But they fight, even then, they're fighting in an uncoordinated manner. And one of the crucial moments when the British are finally defeated, I think it's on the 8th December, when the Kohistanis attack the British, and Shelton, who's this hopeless brigadier, marches his force up to the top of the hill, where they just get shot at. They sit in a square at the top, and the Afghans don't engage them. They just sit at the bottom of the hill, shooting up at them, and row after row of these Brits kind of reform their square in this totally hopeless manner. They didn't fire back. When they see this happening, the royalists under Aminullah Khan Logari come out from the old city, and there's a cavalry charge. And in British accounts, it's as if it's a sort of strategic thing that they wait for the moment, and then the cavalry appear at the right moment. It's clear from the Afghan accounts that they just hear that the British are about to be defeated and join in, and it's so there's no coordination, and so you get. And I think the same, you could draw a parallel with that and what's going on today, because so often in Western media, the current resistance to the ISAF forces is presented as the Taliban. In reality, you have a whole wide variety of different sorts of Afghans who are pissed off against the West for a whole variety of very good and very different reasons. And not all, many of whom have absolutely no connection with Mullah Omar or the Taliban whatsoever. They're just Afghans in turbans taking pot shots. And Taliban is very often no more than a shorthand.
But a strategically useful one on the part of the West, at times.
But yes, but also one that obscures the reality. And the more you obscure the reality, the less you understand what's going on.
But strategic utility and reality rarely match.
Peter.
Partly coming off of Sujata's questions regarding, and your own, about the current landscape, invoking China and getting a sense of the geopolitics now. I'm very interested to know how the Russians perceived this entire sequence, and wanted to know whether there are indeed Russian accounts, given what you portrayed as their particular interests coming right up into the vicinity. How did they react? How did they perceive what had happened? And are there indeed Russian accounts of this? And what does explain their failure, if that's the right word, to take advantage of this sudden British reversal?
It's a very good question. There's a really good work forthcoming on this by Alexander Morrison, who used to be at All Souls, now at Liverpool, who's done a lot of work on Central Asian sources and spent time in all the archives in the Stans. And also done a lot of work in St. Petersburg. And the Russians had this catastrophic expedition to Khiva, which takes place as the British are moving into Afghanistan and as a Russian response to it. If you can take Kabul, we'll take Khiva. But they have a wipeout. And Petrovsky, who's the man who leads that expedition, is humiliated and demoted because of this. So the Russians don't move again until the 1860s. And Morrison's work is called Two Parallel Expeditions. And the same way that the defeat of the British in 1842 puts a stasis on British interaction with Afghanistan, there is what John Lawrence calls, what's the phrase he uses? Masterful inaction, or masterly inactivity. And in a sense, that's what you have on both sides. You have masterly inactivity. Neither of them move forward. And then there's a second rush into imperial conquest in the 1860s and 1870s. So the two defeats put a stop to expansionism on both sides for a bit.
So it wasn't just the chance or the climate of the fact of the blizzard that had accounted for that disaster for the Russians at Khiva. They had a more sort of geopolitical understanding.
No, I mean,
or did they write that off as just?
I don't know this well, but my understanding, reading Morrison's work, is that had the expedition been a success, I think one could, and as indeed had the British expedition into Afghanistan been a success, one might have seen much more activity between the Russians and the British in Central Asia much sooner. But the fact that both ended in humiliation and the resignation of the people held responsible for these debacles, it puts the frighteners, if you like, on anyone else doing it for 20 years.
And they end up fighting in the Crimea, of course, soon thereafter. So it just sort of
Crimea's the next
relocates the source of the...
Maybe to conclude, just a quote from just as the Second Anglo-Afghan War is beginning, one of the few survivors of this one, George Lawrence, writes to the Times as an old man. He says, "A new generation has arisen, which instead of profiting from the solemn lessons of the past, is willing and eager to embroil us again in the affairs of that turbulent and unhappy country. Although military disasters may be avoided this time, an advance now, however successful from a military point of view, would not fail to be as politically useless. The disaster of the retreat from Kabul should stand forever as a warning to the statesmen of the future not to repeat the policies that bore such bitter fruit in 1839 to 42.
And why does nobody heed these warnings?
What's Huxley's famous line? That the only thing you learn from history is that no one learns anything from history.
Exactly. Yeah. The last question here.
Thank you very much. So I wanted to, first of all, thank you for all of your work. City of Gins was an important and fabulous book for me.
Thank you.
My question is less about the history and more about the personal side. And I was hoping that you could speak perhaps about your experience as a Britisher becoming so involved in this region and so invested in this region. You talked about sort of forces besides the Taliban, sort of some of the legitimate concerns regarding the West that come out of this region. And was wondering if you could speak about some of those tensions, sort of the inability to ever become part of this world, but then on the other hand, how do you come back and explain this world to the folks back home who don't have such a great understanding?
Yeah, I mean, I've been based in out of Delhi now, coming on for 25 years now. And I think sort of socially and personally, there is a feeling of frustration that however long you spend in India, you can never be an Indian. I don't know whether any immigrant in any world can totally become, their children can. I mean, I think you know, an Indian or an Afghan arriving in Boston probably can't ever become American, but the kids who go to the American schools really can become American. But I think for a writer, to be in the situation I am now, which is both an insider and an outsider, is quite a useful perspective. The same thing that leads to frustration personally, continually coming across, even after 25 years, references that I don't understand, either to Bollywood or to songs that mean huge amounts to everybody else in the room and I've never heard of. These sudden moments when you suddenly realize how much of an outsider you are, that there's lots of references you get, but suddenly something comes, everyone else goes, ah, and what the fuck are they talking about? But equally, I think as an outsider, you spot things that the insider misses. I mean, I wander around London, and lots of London is invisible to me because it's so familiar. I wander around Scotland, and a lot of Scotland's, I don't see the red phone boxes or the double-decker buses or the black London taxis because that's just what's there. It's the wallpaper that you don't notice. And I think you do have a slight edge on the people living with you if you're writing, in that you have slightly sharper eyes for some things, even though you misinterpret others. It swings and roundabouts. I mean, as a writer, I mean, with Nine Lives is a good example of that. It's about all the Baals and the Sufis and it's the classic sort of thing that a Westerner will always want to write about India, and no India would dream of writing about or touching, because it's kind of, you have a stream of fantastic non-fiction books coming out of India at the moment, a real renaissance in non-fiction, but it's all sort of gritty urban realism and this sort of stuff that's perceived as, exotic old India. It's just not there.
Would you graduate from old India to new India?
I've written a bit about New India. I mean, I have a second career as a journalist, and I'm officially my position in India, as far as the government is concerned, is that I'm the New Statesman correspondent. That's how I get my visa. I write 2 articles a year.
Well, keep writing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very, very well.